Hey everyone, welcome back to another day in the shop with Edla, the Expedicion de las Americas CJ-7. I'm Chris Collard. This is Gone Cheapin'. Today we are going to be installing a new set of super lift springs and getting into the details on how to measure for a set of new drive lines with a new suspension. Stick around, should be fun. All right, so we got the old spring and the new spring side by side here on the shop floor. And obviously the new spring has more of an arc to it. But the important thing is, and this is why you want to make sure your suspension is set up the way you're going to be running it when you measure for your drive lines, is because if you look at this, it looks like the center pins, or where the axle rides, is about maybe 1/2 inch, 5/8 of an inch difference, which will obviously affect where your axle's riding and how your drive line performance, how long it should be, basically when it's fully articulated or at full droop. How long do those splines need to be with how much spline in the receiving end of it, the female end of it, to make sure that the thing doesn't fall out. But we do have a difference in where this pin is, but is there a difference? That's my question. So we're gonna measure, and what you wanna do is you wanna measure the very center of the bolt, of the bushing bolt, to the centering pin. We're gonna measure that out, and that's coming out with 22 3/4 inches. And you, of course, make sure that you've got the front of the spring, back of the spring, same on both of them, where you're gonna have a challenge. So we'll measure off of the center of the new spring, right at about 22 3/4 inches. So same distance. It may have the appearance of being in a different place, but it's the same distance from the transfer case, same distance from the spring perch in the front of the spring, so we're okay there. So we're gonna put this back up, and we'll swap out the other side, drop it down, then we'll measure the drive line. So if you've ever wrestled a leaf spring in on a spring perch, you know they can be a bugger, right? Especially used stuff. So this thing's been twisted up when the axle articulates. It's put a huge amount of load on the spring perches, and they'll have a tendency to kind of walk one way or the other. Sometimes they'll flange out, sometimes they kind of pinch together. This one feels pretty square, but I got a little ridge there. And you can save yourself some grief by taking your grommets and just find out if it's gonna slip up in there. It's a lot easier to do it with a 10-ounce grommet than it is to do it when you get your leaf spring, trying to wrestle the leaf spring up there. You don't want it to be loose, but this one's just a hair tight, but you can take a couple thousandths off of it, and we're gonna do that on the grinding wheel. Fortunately, it comes out. Oh yeah, it's just about it right there. And we're gonna put new bolts in it eventually, but we're just gonna, make sure everything's fitting before we wrestle a big spring up there. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that some of the newer shackles have bolts with a zerk fitting right down the middle. I think I'm going to try to source some of those because it's pretty cool. Super lift on their spring kit. The sleeves have a hole, and that's what basically you push the grease in via zerk fitting on the end of that. It runs through, comes out in the bolt, so it's always nice and lubricated, and this actually comes up through that little hole onto the bushings. Yeah, nice. Another thing I want to show you is this little shim. This looks like, 4 degrees maybe. The tall end of the shim is going to go in the front, and the reason is that it rolls the axle up to reduce the U-joint and driveline angles. Yep, it's going. I'm going to grab it's kind of like a marlin spike, which is an old term used, from the whaling or the fishing days to spike marlin. So I'm keeping my hand on it just in case it decides it wants to go somewhere. Grab my bolt. There we go. Loose fit here, so I'm just gonna put it out on the other end of it. If it'll go back on. So when you put these bolts in, of course these are all gonna be replaced, but you wanna make sure you're pretty centered. You don't wanna drive on it like too hard if it's jamming it in, because you'll strip out the threads on the end. Now I'm realizing a whole nother situation. This exhaust was put on with the other suspension. I can see on full droop, it's got just a little bit of clearance issue. I'm gonna loosen up the exhaust bracket and roll it off to the passenger side. All right, so one other thing we're noticing here is that center pin looked a little bit the same distance away from the front of the spring eyelet, but you can see where I jacked up the axle off the original spring. It's not lining up with the centering pin. So, you know, at this point, it's not a big deal because it'll just slide forward on the splines on the driveline, but it's a good argument for why you want to measure for your drive lines with your final suspension setup on. I was going to drop it down to the ground and like crawl underneath and measure this thing, but I realized, like, you know what, I got these cool hoist jacks that I got from Harbor Freight, about $100 a piece. They're rated to 2,000 pounds. You can see there's just a 1/4 inch clearance on the rear. The front is still, and the suspension is sitting the way it will on the ground. So to measure for your drive lines, this is through Tom Woods, and they give you a chart on their website when you're putting in your order. But basically what you want to do is you want to measure from the front face of the yoke flange, where you've got the end of the yoke. What you want to do is you want to measure from the front, the yoke, and the back to the same point on the back of the transfer case, or the yoke comes out of the transfer case. And what we come up with is right at about 25 3/4 inches. So that's going to be the measurement they're going to need for the rear drive line. So we just move around, we'll do the same thing on the front, send those off, and hopefully in a week or so we'll have some new drive lines for Edla. All right, guys, that is it for today. We got our specs out to Tom Woods Custom Drive Shafts. Tomorrow, we're going to be pulling the axle shafts out, inspecting the bearings, pulling the brakes apart, and then eventually dropping that AMC 20 and getting it ready for a full resto. Hope you can join us.